The animating question that I want to ask today, which I'm going to ask in a very animating question that I want to ask today, which I'm going to ask in a very our topic today. Animating question that I want to ask today, which I'm going to ask in a very our topic today. Animating question that I want to ask today, which I'm going to ask in a very our topic today. Much deeper anxieties among American Jews about sovereignty and what a state of Israel would look like, right? And defies a longer story, which I want to try to tell today, of deep ambivalence within the rabbinic tradition especially, about the exercise of power and the exercise of force. What's interesting is taking that moment, that snapshot of the normalcy that we tend to embody and experience as a Jewish community around this military ethics and military force, means that those who are outside that consensus, Jews, for instance, who claim that it is anti-Jewish to have an army and to use military force, are considered to be the ideological outliers in the context of our contemporary Jewish community. I want to challenge that a little bit today, not because my own politics suggests that I am personally uncomfortable with the state of Israel and with the Jewish army, but because what I think one of the questions we really have to wrestle with is, in what ways does a Judaism that lives freely and comfortably in a language of force and army, is that the same Judaism that we have been inheriting in our literature and our history for the last 2,000 years? And if it's not, what work do we have to actually do within the context of our tradition and our Judaism to make a coherent case for it? Because even that consensus is beginning to break down, especially in the American Jewish community, with the emergence of Jewish voices claiming that the normative Jewish argument is for peace and not for war. What I want to try to do today is to argue for a political theory of Rabbinic Judaism, and hopefully one that's a little bit unsettling. By its nature, making an argument for a political theory from a corpus and a canon that spans hundreds of years and thousands of pages of text is going to be at best suggestive and necessarily selective, right? Even with an extremely thick packet by Hartman Institute morning session standards, I have done no justice to the full comprehensive narrative of Rabbinic Judaism. I am selecting a handful of texts. However, I do think that they are in some respects representative. And the argument, the political theory that I want to try to argue for is that the making of Rabbinic Judaism, the Judaism that we have used to build ourselves up, that has scaffolded our history for the past 2,000 years, and of which we are the inheritors, involved a conscious and profound choice against sovereignty, and against, more importantly, the military and technical trappings of sovereignty, army, war, and political power. And what I want to try to do is argue that if that's the context of the Rabbinic Judaism that we inherited, and the reality of contemporary Judaism involves a deep inhabiting of sovereignty, political power, and the use of force, we have a dissonance that we have to sit in and reconcile. And rather than making an argument that those who would argue against the state of Israel and its use of power and its use of force are implicitly anti-Jewish, we have to instead make a constructive argument about what the Jewishness that we want to inhabit in this present day actually consists of and look like. That's the political theory I'd like to do today. And I want to do this by looking at rabbinic sources that address this issue from a variety of ways. One, in how the rabbis even understand their own myth of origins, where they come from, what's the core narrative for the emergence of Rabbinic Judaism. I'm going to look at a text that some of you may be familiar with, the escape of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to Yavne on the verge of the destruction of Jerusalem, and I want to read it with a political theory lens. I want to read that story as not merely a morality tale about can't we all just get along, which is oftentimes the way it's portrayed, but actually as a deeply subversive argument about Jews and political power. I want to do this by looking at a set of sources in the interpretive tradition, where the rabbis took teachings and traditions about the use of military force that they were taking from the Bible and subverted them to argue that that's not what they were really about at all, and distancing from the original intention of the text to try to make a different ethical pro-peace argument from actual texts that were about war. I want to do this in reference to a few examples of history and memory, when the rabbis are recounting historical events that involve Jews in the interface with power and use of force, and the remaking of those stories to embrace, instead of revolution and power, martyrdom and pogroms. Ideology of martyrdom emerges as being an ethically superior ideology to the ideology of rebellion. And ultimately, I want to make this point with respect to theology. If we're going to argue about what the meaning of our political force is and the political power, where does God fit into that story, and how are we meant to interpret the larger lesson of all of this? What I want to conclude with is to come back to the animating question. If I do my job correctly today, and if I can make a compelling case that Rabbinic Judaism has essentially makes the case for pacifism, not passivism, pacifism, if Rabbinic Judaism has a pacifistic impulse to it, what do we do as both modern Jews today, inheritors of that Rabbinic tradition, and sitting here in the state of Israel, in this Beit Midrash, with Jewish Israeli soldiers with weapons sitting not 30 meters away from us, what do we do to hold those two phenomena in tension, or at least, perhaps more effectively, in dialogue with each other? Let's start first with the myth of origins, and this text, the packet that I have today is the orange one if you don't have it, the color of the disengagement. The first text that I want to do today is the Myth of Origins text, and this is a famous piece of Talmud from the tractate of Gittin in the Babylonian Talmud, unpacking and recounting over several pages, and we're going to do this selectively. We could spend all hour and a half that we have today on simply components of this text, but I'm going to pick a few pieces. You have it to take with you and to learn more beyond what we do today. The larger narrative of this text involves trying to offer a theological explanation or a communal explanation for the destruction of the temple. Now, the very act of trying to provide a theological or ethical explanation for the destruction of the temple means, and I think this is critical, that we are no longer operating in political realism. We are now operating in mythical, in the terrain of the mythical. An argument for political realism would say, what are the political realities with which the Jews in Judea lived in the years 60 and 70 that brought about, or ultimately first, a rebellion against Rome and the catastrophe that resulted in the destruction of the temple? And that work of historians continues and is ongoing. There's an enormous amount of literature on the socioeconomic conditions that existed in Judea in the year 60 and 65 that led to a popular uprising, claiming that it wasn't really political, but it was economic. You can make all sorts of arguments about why it is that this small group of people in the midst of the largest empire in the world were essentially unique among all of the territories that were captured by the Roman Empire and rebelled against Rome not just once, but twice. There's a profound set of historical and political conditions that one could use to unpack that story, and it is not at all what the rabbis decide to do. Instead, they tell the story through the prism of what it is to be learned from this story, morally and ethically, and the message of that they ultimately will claim is that what there is to be learned morally and ethically is that we as Jews are in some ways at odds with or threatened by the very political circumstances in which we live, and our choice is to extricate ourselves from those political realities and instead try to construct a Judaism that can be construed as ethical within the boundaries that we actually can control. the hint to this comes right in the first opening of the text. If you look at the second sentence on the first page, the destruction of Jerusalem came through a kamsa and a bar kamsa. The destruction of Tur Malka came through a cock and a hen. The destruction of Beitar came through a shaft of leather. The rabbis take three dramatic political realities, the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of Tur Malka, and the destruction of Beitar, and turn them into memorizable aphorisms. These are not, they turn them into memorizable aphorisms. They turn them into little Ben Franklin-like mnemonics of little stories which tell of much larger and more lofty political realities than the ones that they're actually going to describe. So what do we mean by the destruction of Jerusalem is relatable through Kamsa and Bar Kamsa? The destruction of Jerusalem came through a Kamsa and a Bar Kamsa in this way. A certain man had a friend named Kamsa and an enemy named Bar Kamsa. Right? You see the problem right in the opening sentence. I have one friend, Tweedledee. I have an enemy, Tweedledum. It's easy to confuse between these two characters. He once made a party and said to a servant, "Go bring Kamsa." The man went and brought Bar Kamsa. When the man who gave the party found him there, he said, "See, you tell tales about me. What are you doing here? I didn't mean for you to come." The invitation was misdirected for reasons that, according to the story, are completely obvious as to why it'd be misdirected. The servant's foolishness correlates to the very foolishness of the entire construct of the story. He says, what are you doing here? Get out." So this poor Bar Kamsa says, "Since I'm here already, let me stay and I'll pay for you whatever I eat and drink." He said, "No." He said, "Okay, then let me pay for half the party." He said, "No." "Then let me pay for the whole party." He still said no, and he took them by the hand and put him out. Now, in classic morality tale, we know where this is headed, right? The story that is actually being played out here is that the destruction of Jerusalem comes about because Jews can't get along with one another. We don't treat each other nicely. And we'll play this, I'll play this out a little bit further, but you can already hear a hint of what's transpiring in the story when I claim that the destruction of Jerusalem happens not because of political, social, and economic conditions that appear in Judea in the year 60 to 65, but when I tell the story as a morality tale about the behaviors in Jewish ethics, I'm already making a claim that politics is subservient to ethics. What I'm claiming is that this is not really a story about Jews living in the real political world. This is a story about the control of our political world through our ethical behavior. This is in itself a deep undermining of the notion of what it means to live in contemporary politics. The story goes on as follows. Said the other, this Bar Kamsa who gets kicked out from the party, "Since the rabbis were sitting there and did not stop them, this shows that they agreed with him." The argument that Bar Kamsa makes is not merely that the society has broken down because this individual person has treated me poorly. The society has broken down because of the larger complicit culture of tolerating this kind of unethical behavior. And this prompts what almost always leads to destruction in rabbinic sources, which is tattletaling. This is why rabbinic sources become so anxious about the idea of the Moser, someone who tells on us to the government, because that ultimately brings about the destruction. That too, that whole ideology being fearful of being told on, is symbolic and representative of being fundamentally powerless. Trying to avoid detection is not a political strategy. It is an avoidance of politics. Avoiding detection is a means of living in isolation and pretending that you're not actually part of the meaningful polity. "I will go inform against them to the government." He went and said to the emperor, "The Jews are rebelling against you." The emperor said, "How can I tell?" And here, in the story that's about to be told, what we will imagine is that the way in which Rome dialogues with rabbis is through halacha. Right? Now, again, the game that's being played here is an argument that says this is how we live in the world, is through halachic behavior and through halachic living, and that our life of halacha is in some ways fundamentally at odds with the political world in which we live, as it goes as follows. He said, "Send them an offering and see whether they will offer it on the altar." Now, what would be the problem? Why would the test be the emperor sending a calf to the Jews and seeing if they'll offer it in the temple in Jerusalem? right? Gentile king, right? Should the offerings come from the Jewish people? For if you were a politically savvy and politically conscious people, the answer to that question is, of course, right? Of course you would, right? You're living in the Roman Empire. Do what he hasn't said to you, he hasn't done what we know to be deeply problematic, which is defiling the altar. He's testing your loyalty. And so the political answer should be, of course, we should sacrifice this in the altar. So the emperor sends with him a fine calf. And now this Bar Kamsa, who turns out is kind of a piece of work, says, while on the way he made a blemish on its upper lip, or as some say on the white of its eye, in a place where we consider it a blemish, and they do not. So what's the problem? This Bar Kamsa knows, because he's part of the orbit and the system, that if he makes a blemish on this animal, that the Romans don't consider a blemish to the animal, that the Romans will expect it to be sacrificed. But if the Jews consider it a blemish, it will be polluted on the altar, and it puts the rabbis in this position of deciding, are we loyal to our own religious traditions, or are we loyal to empire? Again, from a political strategy standpoint, the blemish, let it go, right? Sacrifice the animal. The rabbis were inclined to offer it in order to not offend the government. The rabbis are sensitive to this, right? Okay, the worst that happens is we'll have to kasher the altar, right? Maybe we realize that what we're doing is offending God a little bit, but surely God will understand in offering the sacrifice that what we're doing is simply trying to stay alive. Surely that is better than offending the emperor. Said Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas to them, a character who is unbeknownst besides this story, people will say that blemished animals are offered on the altar. What's the problem with offering this? What will the people say? Again, as a political argument, an extremely weak one. As an internal, self-conscious, self-anxious people, it's very telling. So the rabbis say, okay, well, what do we do instead? This is an amazing line. They propose to kill Bar Kamsa, so he should not go and inform against them. But Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas once again comes along and says, is one who makes a blemish on consecrated animals to be put to death? Rabbi Yochanan thereupon remarked, through the scrupulousness of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas, our house has been destroyed, our temple burnt, and we ourselves exiled from our land. The message that the rabbis are actually putting forward here is that we are incapable of making difficult political decisions, and that in some deep ways, our own halacha, the language of observance and ritual that we have embraced for ourselves, is what sets us at odds with the societies and politics in which we live. That the scrupulousness of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas, who is not undermined in the story for being halachically inaccurate, right? Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas makes 2 points which are correct. We don't kill people for making blemishes on animals, and we certainly don't kill people. We don't kill people for making blemishes on animals, and we don't. And that's one argument. And the second thing he says, you're right. We don't offer blemished animals on the altar. But from a pragmatic perspective, both of those arguments are foolish. From a pragmatic perspective, the argument should have been, shut up, Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas. Let's deal with the internal consequences of what happens when blemished animals are offered on the altar. Right? People may say the temple has become polluted because of a Roman offering that was impure. I can deal with that problem. That's survival. I can also even, right, and this is more challenging, deal with taking care of Bar Kamsa. Right? The scrupulousness of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas is that he cautioned them, you can't kill him for making a blemished animal, putting a blemished animal on the altar. But they're not killing him. They're not proposing to kill him because he put a blemish on the animal. They're proposing to kill him because he was subverting and undermining the entirety of their own relationship to the Roman Empire. That's death penalty worthy. If you want to survive vis-a-vis the Roman Empire, that's death penalty worthy. And this language, the scrupulousness of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas, teases out their own self-critical understanding that their ideology, their adherence to halacha, and their consciousness of their own internal language and terminology is actually undermining their ability to live within the context of sovereignty in the realpolitik that living in a political reality demands. I want to skip ahead and do a couple of other sections here of the story. If you go to the bottom of page 2, The famous part of the story is that at the pretext here, the rabbis are now stuck in Jerusalem as part of a larger Roman siege that's taking place on the outside. The rabbis have already articulated in the story that they would like to see the people make peace with the Romans, i.e. capitulate, right, rather than stand in the siege in Jerusalem against the Roman Empire. It is clear, according to this narration of the story, that the city is being controlled by characters who the rabbis refer to as thugs, who are controlling the city and making the political decisions, which is casting them in direct opposition to the Roman Empire. The rabbis, however, stand at odds with the thugs who are controlling the city, trying to resolve the tension of the situation. But what is critical for the passage we're about to read is that the temple is still standing and Jerusalem is still sovereign. It may be on the verge of destruction, but the temple is still standing and Jerusalem is still sovereign. We read at the bottom of page 2. Abba Sikra, the head of the thugs in Jerusalem, was the son of the sister of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Okay, so the head of the rabbis, his nephew, is the one who's actually in charge of the siege of the Jews in Jerusalem who are standing against the siege. These are all members of the same family. There's an intimacy to both political sides of this conflict with Rome. The latter, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, sends him a message, quietly says, "Come visit me privately." When he came to him, he said, "How long are you going to carry on in this way and kill all the people with starvation? We're stuck in the midst of a siege that Rome is casting against us. How long are you going to persist in the siege? It's folly. You're not going to defeat the Roman Empire," which of course turns out to be true. He replied, "What can I do? If I say a word to them, they will kill me." The head of the thugs in this narration of the story is essentially claiming, at this point, I'm powerless against those who are more zealous and fundamentalist than me, and so I'm carrying out a political ideology that I don't even support. He said, "Devise some plan for me to escape," and here's the key line, "Perhaps I will be able to save a little." This becomes the normative political ideology of Rabbinic Judaism. This one line, "Perhaps I will be able to save a little." He said to him, "Pretend to be ill and let everyone come and inquire about you. Bring something that smells very bad and put it next to you so that they will say that you are dead." What is the incredible metaphor or the myth that the rabbis are telling in order to imagine the escape from Jerusalem is their own death. Pretend to be dead. Right? So people will come visit you. They'll know that they're visiting you as a corpse. You put something evil smelling next to you and people will, understand that you are a corpse. And based on the rule of ancient sieges, you let the corpses out. Right? Because otherwise you bring around horrendous public health consequences. Then let your disciples get under your bed, meaning they're going to be your pallbearers, but no others, so that they will not notice you are still light, since everybody knows that a living being is lighter than a corpse. A little iffy, but fine, we can leave that aside. He did so, and Rabbi Eliezer went under the bier from one side and Rabbi Joshua from the other. When they reached the door, right, so now what they're doing is escorting their teacher who's pretending to be a corpse out of Jerusalem. And I don't want to lose this metaphor that they're actually, in order to survive, they're imagining themselves as dead. That's the story that the rabbis are thinking of themselves from a political perspective. In order to survive, we are functionally dead. And there's two students on one side. The thugs want to stab into the corpse to make sure that it's dead. He said to them, "Shall the Romans say they have pierced their master?" They wanted to give it a push, and they said, "Shall they say they pushed their master?" You hear the echoes of the Zechariah ben Avkula story there, of what are they going to say? And they use that language of what are they going to say to instrumentalize his own escape from Jerusalem. He escapes. He comes to the king Vespasian. There's a whole narrative back and forth in which he essentially predicts that Vespasian, when this is actually historically true, unlike a lot of other pieces of rabbinic stories, is about to become the Roman emperor, is actually now leading the siege against Jerusalem, but is about to be called back to be the emperor. And after he actually says to him, "You're about to be the emperor," Vespasian says to him, "Okay, now that you've come to me, and you've paid your loyalty and you've predicted that I'm emperor, I will grant you a request. What request do you want?" And we're going to look at the bottom of page 3. And here there's the startling moment, which is almost the punchline of the story in terms of the political theory of Rabbinic Judaism. He says to him, "I am now going and will send some other general to take my place. You can, however, make a request of me and I will grant it." So now here it is. This is you opened the genie in the bottle. You have the emperor of the Roman Empire standing in front of you. You have Jerusalem under siege and in terrible condition, but still standing. The temple is still standing. The politically savvy argument is obvious. If you're given one choice in this moment, what do you ask for? Jerusalem. Instead, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, and it's always startling to me, that this becomes claimed as a core mythic, the core mythic narrative of Rabbinic Judaism, with a great sense of pride that in this moment, the story of the Jewish people in diaspora becomes born, when in fact it's actually a deep betrayal of living in any sort of meaningful relationship to sovereignty. He asks for, give me Yavne and its wise sages, and the family chain of Rabban Gamliel and physicians to heal Rabbi Tzadok. What does he ask for? I want a sleepy beach town for me and my friends. And a doctor, right? Also, send a doctor. I want my chain, the people I talk to, the community in which I live, the rabbis who are going to ultimately reconstitute Judaism. I want us to have a place far removed from the center of political power in Jerusalem, located out there, and send a doctor also because one of our rabbis is in bad shape. This is the most bizarre request imaginable. Now, from the perspective of a tradition that's telling a story centuries after the fact, which is probably this Gemara, it makes sense to try to understand that our myth of origins is not when the temple got destroyed, we reconstituted Judaism. In other words, the argument that's being played out here, the reason why the rabbis tell the story is because it's important for them to locate the birth of Rabbinic Judaism while the temple still stands. So that lest we think that the Rabbinic Judaism is only inferior to Temple Judaism, it actually has its roots, historically and mythically, in the era of the temple itself. That's the internal logic of why to tell the story this way. But the larger political logic is inexplicable. Why tell a story, even if you wanted to make something up? Make something up in which you say he asked for Jerusalem, he begged for Jerusalem, and when he was denied, he was offered a weak alternative that he took. And instead, this is the core request that he ultimately makes. This tells a story about what this tradition wants to imagine about itself. Rabbi Akiva, and so conscious is the text even of the absurdity of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's request, that it actually says the next line in the voice of Rabbi Akiva, thought to be the greatest of all sages. In the next line actually makes the critique explicit. Rabbi Akiva applied to him the verse, God turns wise men backwards and makes their knowledge foolish. You know, sometimes when the rabbis apply a verse to somebody, they do it with subtlety. Not so here. This is not a subtle application of a verse. God makes wise men foolish. He should have said to him, let them off this time. However, he thought he wouldn't get so much, not so much we would grant, and so even a little would be saved. This whole ideology of trying to salvage a little bit tells an implicit story about how we see ourselves in relationship to the political realities in which we operate. And the fact that they attribute to Rabbi Akiva the willingness to undermine and criticize the ancestor of Rabbinic Judaism, to claim that he missed an opportunity to actually save the Jewish people and instead chose this bizarre choice of living out, going out to Yavne and being saved, suggests that he had done something profoundly foolish. The very embrace within the context of our tradition of this story as being the animating myth of our Judaism suggests that we have kind of accepted the choice of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai as a willful abandonment of that story, Jerusalem siege and sovereignty, and instead an embrace of the story inside the Beit Midrash of Yavne. Let me move on to another text, and we'll see this play out as well. If you look at Dvarim, what's that? We'll come back to the death of Titus. Another example, in the interpretive tradition, if you look at Dvarim Rabbah on page 8, right? So one story is, what's the myth by which we understand ourselves? And what's remarkable about that myth is the willingness to tell a story that actually is politically embarrassing. The second idea I want to put on the table is that the rabbis take pieces of the biblical tradition that explicitly talk about war and peace from a political perspective and translate into being ethically significant. And that choice in and of itself involves a kind of abandonment or forfeiting of political realism and trading that political realism for ethics. So the example that we have here is in Devarim, Deuteronomy chapter 5. It imagines that when you're going to war against a city, the first thing you're supposed to do is issue a call for peace. Apropos of Daniel's talk yesterday, this peace that you issue as a call to another population when you're about to destroy it is a peace that's instrumental to conquest. Right? You're not asking to actually be at peace with them. You're asking them to surrender. Right? That's it's actually a very challenging notion of peace that the rabbis have here, and so they unmake it. They undo it. It's uncomfortable for them to think of peace in language in relationship to conquest, and instead they say as follows. They give a number of explanations. This becomes a long excursus in rabbinic literature about the value of peace, which totally misses the text that it's actually meaning to interpret. They say as follows: what does it mean, proclaim peace to it? Come see how great the power is, the power of peace. One explanation: if a person injures his neighbor, he never forgets it, but not so God. Israel was in Egypt, and the Egyptians enslaved them with lime and bricks. After all the evil they had done to Israel, God had pity upon them and decreed, "You shall not abhor an Egyptian because you are a stranger in his land, but pursue after peace, as it is said, seek peace and pursue it." Look how great God is. That even when human beings actually come into conflict with one another, they never forgive one another. However, when God is actually with the Israelites in Egypt and sees what they endure, demands of the Jews that they be above political petty grudges and vengeances, and instead embody an ethic and a culture of peacemaking. Look at how subversive this is an interpretation of peace of conquest. This is peace of maturity. Look how big. We're above the politics of trying to get back at the Egyptians. Instead, we are meant to embody something different. But even better, another explanation, a wonderful story about Rabbi Meir. What is the meaning of the phrase pursuing peace? Bakesh Shalom v'radfehu, seek peace and pursue it. Once Rabbi Meir was sitting and expounding. He was teaching a shiur in the Beit Midrash. And a woman happened to be sitting there. That woman went home, it being Shabbat evening, and found that her Shabbat light had gone out. Interpret this as you will. I think it's probably meant to have a kind of sexual innuendo. She comes home and, late. Her husband has been waiting for her, right? And the fire is out, so to speak. Her husband says to her, "Where have you been so late?" She replied, "I was listening to Rabbi Meir's discourse," not helping her case. Now that man, being, as the rabbis say, a clown, said to her, "You will not enter my house, whatever happens, until you have gone and spat in the face of Rabbi Meir." Or it's like, why? You embarrassed me, right, by being loyal to him on this Friday night, right? There's a kind of transposition of her husband versus her teacher, right? So you're not allowed back with me until you actually go and shame him. Elijah of blessed memory, who is like the great Waldo of rabbinic texts, finds himself in good places at the right time to help fix problems that otherwise would be unfixable. Elijah of blessed memory told Rabbi Meir what happened. So what did Rabbi Meir do? He went and sat down in the great house of study. The woman came in to pray, and on seeing her, Rabbi Meir pretended to be blinking. He said out loud, "Who knows how to cure a sore eye? Like, do you have some technique to fix a sore eye?" Whereupon the woman replied, "I know how to cure it by a charm," and she spat in his face. Thereupon he said to her, "Tell your husband, look, I have spat in the face of Rabbi Meir." He further said to her, "Go become reconciled with your husband. See how great is the power of peace." It's a great story, right? It's loaded, right? For another topic on sex ethics and the rabbis, we could spend a lot more time on this. Next year, Judaism and the body. The argument I want to make about this text is that what it has done, it has taken a piece out of the parshat about war and conquest and the use of peace and has domesticated it. Peace is a domestic activity about what happens between husband and wives. It is a story about the shaming of the rabbi as a means of actually promoting peace between a man and his wife. Right? It is an effort to move from the specific military language that the context of the text is meant to use with a kind of implicit discomfort. Like, what do I have to learn about the portion in Deuteronomy about war and peace in that particular context? That's actually useless to me. What's useful to me is to imagine that language of militarism and peace actually helps resolve tensions that exist within the context of domestic environments and tensions that are actually sometimes even created by the mechanics of Rabbinic Judaism. That being loyal to showing up to the synagogue and the Beit Midrash of the rabbis may sometimes create conflict. Torah brings about sometimes conflict, but so great is the power of peace that we are willing sometimes as the sages to shame ourselves in order to bring peace between a wife and a husband. I'm going to skip over King David. If we have time, we can go back to it. But I'll tell you the reason I brought this source here on page 10 is another version of the interpretive move of what the rabbis are trying to do. And here too, the rabbis take a story about King David, in which King David is imagined going to war with the Philistines, and they turn King David from being a military leader into a rabbi. It's a classic technique of the rabbis is making other people rabbis, right? They do that not only through ordination, but through interpretation. And what they take a comment of King David that describes him sending off his people into war, and instead they interpret it to being him asking a halachic question. Now, what's the psychology of why you want to turn King David from being a military leader to a great sage? The psychology is that from their imagination, and this is the argument I'm trying to make, in their imagination there's nothing higher than being a rabbinic sage, right? It's a self-referential ideology. There's nothing higher than being a rabbinic sage, and that what it does is it undermines, on political level, it undermines the kind of legitimacy and credibility that King David has in their own mythic imagination from being significant because of his conquests and military leadership on behalf of the Israelites, and instead makes him stand out as being powerful and significant because of his ability to read a text. Now again, let's think psychologically about the impact and the consequence that does to us as readers of this tradition. Does it implicitly, and I think it does, undermine the credibility of somebody like King David because of his military conquests, and instead place him second on the hierarchy to the ability and mastery of someone who's able to read a text? This interpretive move, this remaking of what leadership looks like in Jewish life, ultimately makes more significant the ability to unpack a text than it is to lead a conquest and a war. Finally, the third section I want to do is on history and memory, and I'll do this very briefly because I want to do some theology as well. In history and memory, here too, one of the central problems that the rabbis have, we saw this a little earlier with the story in Gittin about Yochanan ben Zakkai, is that they're trying to tell a story that involves their own historical political agency. Right? They were part of these rebellions against Rome, and at the same time, they have to acknowledge that agency, and on the other hand, they ultimately feel in historical retrospect that that political activity was fundamentally foolish. How do I own that story? And one of the mechanisms that they use to own that story is to ramp up their own sense of foolishness in that battle, and ultimately the value of martyrdom and victimhood. One way they do this is in talking about Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kokhba. If you look at the top of page 14, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai taught, Akiva, my master, expounded, a star will go forth from Jacob, as Koziba has come forth from Jacob. Quoting the verse from Numbers, a star, a kochav, will come out from Yaakov. They call Bar Kokhba, the person of the star, has that kind of self-conscious ideology that he's a messianic figure. But they say, Rabbi Akiva, I'll back up. Rabbi Akiva is one of the few sages who actually backed Bar Kokhba in his unbelievably foolish rebellion against the Romans, which ultimately led to catastrophic destruction and massacres. Right? The foolishness of Rabbi Akiva. When Rabbi Akiva would see Bar Koziva, he would say, this is the King Messiah. Right? So he was living politically within an ideology of messianism, and the rabbis hated this. Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta said to him, Akiva, grass will grow on your cheeks, and still the son of David will not have come. You will be long dead and buried with grass growing out of your grave long before messianism and redemption is even possible. So the first thing they do is they dramatically criticize and undermine the capacity of Jews to see themselves as being part of a politically redemptive process. The end of this story winds up being a catastrophic series of victimhood and martyrdom. If you look at the bottom of page 15, it was taught. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said there were 500 schools in Beitar, and the smallest of them had no fewer than 500 children. There were a lot of children, right? Which is another way of saying we actually had a huge population, right? We had a huge population, and all these schools were filled with children. And the children used to say, it's a devastating text, if the enemy comes upon us, we will go out against them with our quills and poke out their eyes. Right? What I hear in this metaphor of this is the origin of the notion that we are people of the book. This is no way to build an army. Right? So you have on one hand the nobility of children thinking that they're going to go out and defeat the Roman army. On the other hand, it is both the foolishness and the nobility of thinking that their swords are actually their pens. Right? And this produces a dramatic martyrdom, the contrast between the people of arms and us who are the people of the pen. As a result of the sins of Israel, the Romans wrapped each one in his book and they burned them. It goes on to say, from all of them, none remained but me. Turns out Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel was telling the story not because he was trying to recollect a historical event that he had no role in, but of all, what's 500 times 500? Anybody know? Thank you. Of all those 250,000, there's one left, and it's me. So my story is he is the inheritance of this network of children who thought they could defeat the Roman army with the use of their pens. To go on to make it even more dramatic, if you look at page 18, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai taught in 3 places, Israel was warned not to return to Egypt, as is written, for you, as you have seen Egypt today, you shall not see them again forever. And it goes on and gives 3 examples of the return to Egypt. If you look at the middle of the paragraph, it tells the 3rd story of the return of the Jewish people to Egypt. In the time of the wicked Trajan, right, so this is now the Roman emperor, not during the destruction of the temple, but in the early 2nd century, a son was born to him on the 9th of Av, and the Jewish people were fasting. Why is this a problem? You know, if the emperor has a child, it should be a feast day for everybody in the Roman Empire. But the Jews, because they're not listening to the political realities of the environment in which they're living, but rather listening to their own liturgical calendar, are, by virtue of the fact that they are good Jews, they are fundamentally set against the political realities of the empire in which they live. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2, his daughter died on Hanukkah, and the Jewish people lit candles. The text is aware of the own ludicrousness of what happens when you are a diasporic people, and you think that you're simply doing your own thing. You think that you're simply being loyal and obedient to your own tradition, and by telling the story in this way, it actually takes Judaism and makes it totally unpragmatic politically, and it sets what it means to live a normative Jewish life against the vitality and possibility of actually living and surviving. Whereas Jewishness becomes almost allergic to the political climate of living as a citizen in the Roman Empire. His wife sent him and said, before you go and do all your conquests, you should take care of the Jews who are rebelling against you. Are they actually rebelling against him? Well, what's interesting is that they might have been. This might be a version of a story that actually masks a real rebellion that may have taken place against the Jews, against their Alexandrian neighbors in the early 2nd century. But the mythic story that the rabbis tell is not one of actual political agency. The mythic story that they want to tell is one of essential, fundamental political allergy to living in the context of the Roman Empire. This is a story in which the Jews have no agency. All they have is their own obedience to their tradition. He ultimately engages them in Torah study. If you skip a few lines down, it says he surrounded them with his legionnaires and massacred them. He said to their wives, obey my legionnaires. In other words, you should sexually submit yourself to my legionnaires and I won't kill you. They said to him, you've killed our husbands, do it to us as well. He murders the men and the women. He commingled their blood, and the blood flowed in the sea until Cyprus. A dramatic portrayal of the violent death of the Jews of Alexandria. This we actually know to be true. Jews in Alexandria had a massive community until the year 115 to 117 CE, when great violence breaks out between the Jews of Alexandria and their neighbors. Rome suppresses the rebellion, and Jews become trace evidence in Alexandria for 2 centuries. You see them periodically on a papyri or a manuscript, but a community of hundreds of thousands of people gets massacred. But the mythical story that the rabbis are doing with respect to history and memory is taking out a notion of any sort of political agency in that rebellion and replacing it with a mythic belonging to an act of victimhood and violence against them. The only time where this has been retrieved is, it's very interesting. The most of the historians who work on this issue of the Jews of Alexandria are actually modern Israelis. And most of that history, somewhat not fully self-consciously, has tried to retrieve and rehabilitate the Jews in Alexandria as rebels. Because if I retrieve that, I'm using my own image of modern Israel as a military force to give dignity back to the Jews of Alexandria, because the idea that martyrdom and victimhood, because you're fundamentally living at odds with that your Judaism makes you live at odds within a political reality, is totally unpalatable to modern Israelis. That Judaism should be thought of as opposite the political normative realities in which we lived is deeply unpalatable. Let me make a couple of final comments, and then I want to open up to some questions and conversation. First, let's go back to the end of the Gittin Gemara, because I want to do one more theological piece. If you go back to page 4. How do the rabbis conclude the story of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem? We'll just read the middle paragraph that starts with Vespasian sent Titus. Vespasian sent Titus, the replacement emperor, who said, "Where is their God, the rock in whom they trusted?" This was the same wicked Titus who blasphemed and insulted heaven. In other words, Titus comes into the temple in Jerusalem and mocks the Jews and mocks God by saying, I can march right in here and nobody's going to stop me. You claim that you're the people of God. Where's your God to stop me? He enters into the Holy of Holies. What did he do? He took a harlot by the hand, entered the Holy of Holies, spread out a scroll of the law, and committed a sin on it. I don't know if you ever did this, but when I was a much younger kid, not this, but when I was much younger, you always play this game of like, what's the worst combination of sins you can do in Judaism at one given time? Titus got it, right? Which is having sex with a harlot in the Holy of Holies on a Torah. Right? This is a deep mocking of the holy place in the center of Jerusalem, and a kind of theological portrayal of, essentially, right? It takes until the 20th century, we think, for Jews to say out loud after Auschwitz that God is dead. That's a part of the theology, post-Auschwitz theology. It's actually here. And it comes next. He then took a sword and slashed the curtain. There was a curtain that separates between the Holy of Holies and the temple and the larger area there. Miraculously, blood spurted out, and he thought he had killed himself. As it is said, your adversaries roared in the midst of your assembly. I don't know that they are telling the story, this metaphor, to imagine that he thinks he kills himself. I think they're telling a story to suggest that in this act of treachery and violence in the Holy of Holies, he kills God. Takes out a sword, performs this act of profound disgust and betrayal in the Holy of Holies, and slashes the curtain, and blood actually spurts out from it. It's a kind of suggestion that part of the reason we have this political ideology of Rabbinic Judaism that's been animated by this text is because of a deep-seated fear that we have as the authors and inheritors of this text, that in this moment of political vulnerability, we're being unprotected. We're actually much more profoundly vulnerable than we think we might be. And then we get the punchline here. Abba Hanan says, "Who is a mighty one? Mi kamocha be'elim Hashem." Who is mighty like you, God? Who is so mighty, so in self-restraint, that you did hear the blaspheming and insults of that wicked man and keep silent? This is an angry, angry theology. Look how strong and great you are, God, that you could be silent in a moment like this, hear this blasphemy and not do something. In the school of Rabbi Yishmael, it was taught, who is like you among the gods? Elim, mi kamocha ba'elim Hashem. Who is like you among the gods? Who is like you among, instead of Elim, Ilmim? Who is like you who is mute? This is a theology of anger and fury at God, which basically says that if this vulnerability that we're cast into with the demise of our political sovereignty suggests that it is not merely a choice that we are making to live outside of political realities, but a consequence that we have that God is no longer protecting us. Now, the interesting thing is, this same theology, that one that would say that we're left vulnerable because God is no longer protecting us, might have yielded a different theology than the one I've presented so far. Jews might have said, if God has abandoned us, we better take damn good care of ourselves. But the interesting thing here is that the theology of divine abandonment actually goes together with the belief of, let's just exit from the political stage of history altogether. We don't want to be there. In essence, God is not protecting us in that story, and so we prefer to be in a narrative of ethics, morals, and values, in an environment that we can ethically control, than a political realities that we can't. If you skip to the modern world, if this becomes the kind of legacy that we have for Rabbinic Judaism, if I've been right, and I'm happy to be challenged when we open up for discussion about whether this is an accurate story or an accurate theory of Rabbinic Judaism, when we come to the modern world, I wanted to read two unbelievably we'll just pick one, unbelievably tendentious modern scholars who take the inheritance of this Rabbinic Judaism and turn it into anti-Zionism. The example we'll use is Professor Daniel Boyarin, really one of the world's leading readers of Talmud, a scholar and professor at the University of California, Berkeley, who at the end of his book on Paul and identity winds up with this unbelievably bizarre chapter called Answering the Mail, in which he translates the legacy of Rabbinic Judaism to mean that not only was this the story that the Jewish people told because they lacked sovereignty in the wake of the destruction of the temple, but this became what Judaism meant. This abandonment of sovereignty, this abandonment of military agency, that's what Judaism became. And as a result, the claim by modern Jews to return to sovereignty is a deep rebellion against Rabbinic Judaism. He says, if you look at top of page 19, the most violent practice that Rabbinic Judaism ever developed vis-a-vis its others was playing cards on Christmas Eve or walking around the block to avoid passing a pagan or Christian place of worship. Something else was needed for the potential racist implications of genealogical particularism to become actualized. That necessity is power over others. This idea was already predicted by the medieval Jewish philosopher Yehuda Halevi, who in his Kuzari has God say to the Jews, your modesty is a function of your powerlessness. When you have power, you will be as cruel as any other people. And continue on page 21. The rabbis produced their cultural formation within conditions of diaspora, that is, in a situation within which Jews did not hold power over others. And I would argue that this is going to get a little bit academic, I would argue that their particular discourse of ethnocentricity is ethically appropriate only when the cultural identity is that of a minority, embattled, or at any rate non-hegemonic. The point is not that the land was devalued by the rabbis, but that they renounced it until the final redemption, because in an unredeemed world, temporal dominion and ethnic particularity are, as I've argued in the last section, impossibly compromised. Skip down 2 sentences. It was political possession of the land which most threatened the possibility of continued Jewish cultural practice and difference. Given the choice between an ethnocentricity which would not seek domination over others, or a seeking of a political domination that would necessarily have led to either a dilution of distinctiveness, tribal warfare, or fascism, the rabbis de facto chose the former. Secular Zionism has unsuccessfully sought the first choice, dilution of distinctiveness. Right? In other words, secular Zionism basically said, in order to make this claim of a return to sovereignty, we're going to renounce that particular narrative of Rabbinic Judaism, which actually opted out of the story of what secular Zionism wanted to see a return to. Religious Zionism has unfortunately, but almost inevitably, led to the second and third choices, i.e. distinctiveness, tribal warfare, and fascism. Either way, Zionism leads to the ruination of Rabbinic Judaism, founded on intense, concrete tribal intimacy, And it is no wonder that until World War II, Zionism was a secular movement, claiming very few adherents among religious Jews, who saw it as a human arrogation of a work that only God should or could perform. This is, moreover, the basis for the anti-Zionist ideology of such groups as Neturei Karta until this day. It was the renunciation of sovereignty over the land that allowed Jewish memory to persist. Another version of this can be found in the text on the next page by George Steiner, a stunning reading of Rabbinic Judaism, which I want to claim, and this is what I've been building to, is not wrong. I don't think Boyarin and Steiner, as readers of rabbinic texts, are wrong. I think there is a deep disclaiming of the narrative of sovereignty, of power, of militarism, and a replacement of that with a kind of, let's close our communities. Let's be minorities in Yavne. Right? Let us imagine that we can't live in that world of sovereignty, and we don't want to. Let us try to imagine that we are essentially martyrs and victims of history much more than active agents and participants. Right? Let's imagine that even the stories that we have in our tradition about King David and the ancestors who come before us who have the full trappings of the military, of power, let's remake them to be sages. That even both the realities in which we live and the memories that we inherit, we wind up imagining a reality that's much more akin to a comprehensive ethics that doesn't need to be compromised by power. Right? That's what we want. And so when Steiner and Boyarin come around after the creation of the State of Israel and say, Zionism, you've ruined the whole thing. You can't co-inhabit between this return to power and sovereignty. You can't be an authentic Jewish soldier with a weapon. Right? What does that even mean? I don't think that they're wrong readers of Rabbinic Judaism. That's what's so devastating about the fact that Boyarin is such a good reader of Talmud. Right? I think he's right. Now, whether that means that the political argument that he's making about the implausibility of Zionism as a meaningful feature of a Jewish identity is right, that's a different story. But the burden winds up becoming on us as both the inheritors of the Rabbinic Judaism that has these seeds in it, and those of us who want to sit in the moment of the State of Israel and say, actually, this is ethically instructive and meaningful because history makes it impossible for us to live with this powerlessness and without sovereignty. That's a tension that we should actually be aware is actually part of what it means to be an inheritor of this Rabbinic Judaism. Instead of what has happened is that we have made the claim, which I think is wrong, that the only way to be an authentic Jew is to actually be in relationship to the State of Israel, because that's a fulfillment of what Judaism has always wanted. And therefore, those who will use Judaism as a blunt instrument against Zionism are fundamentally inauthentic. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that that's an accurate reflection or an accurate reading of what Rabbinic Judaism sought to do. So I want to offer two modern responses that, in my view, acknowledge this problem and try to make a challenge to it and a change. And with this, I'll conclude, and they are Yitz Greenberg and David Hartman. Yitz Greenberg makes one argument where he says, essentially, in order to stand in relationship to the State of Israel, we must end the idea that martyrdom is a Jewish value. In other words, it's a historically contingent argument. The narrative of Rabbinic Judaism worked for 2,000 years. The Holocaust ends it. He says quite beautifully on page 24 in the middle, thus the Holocaust brought an end to the period of Galut Judaism. The Jewish ethic of powerlessness had given dignity and ethical direction for almost 2,000 years in diaspora. Emancipation had begun to erode this tradition. Or actually even just go to the bottom of page 25. One might add that the decision to create the state and take power also constitutes a commitment to end the martyrdom tradition of Jewish history. Since martyrdom means the risk of total annihilation, it is no longer acceptable. What Yitz is doing, and you have to hear how radical this is. He's not saying we're returning to what Judaism was meant to be. He's saying, I'm actually making a break. I'm saying that story of Judaism that is animated for 2,000 years is no longer plausible. He puts a big burden on himself of what it means to be a semi-rabbinic Jew, inheriting some of this rabbinic Judaism without all of its political ideology. But there's a radical claim, I don't want that story anymore. Right? It's a hard move. It's easier to be a secular Zionist and say, I'm not bound by rabbinic Judaism. Doesn't mean anything to me. Yitz is trying to say, yes, in some ways I am bound by Rabbinic Judaism, but I'm no longer allowing that to be the dominant historical narrative. And the second argument is the argument of David Hartman, where he says, this is in the Israelis and the Jewish tradition, a series of lectures he gave at Yale, Israel is not a return to a religious or political ghetto where Jewish particularity and universality conflict, where symbolic religious ritual and the passion for social justice are unrelated expressions of loyalty to traditional Judaism. Israel represents the birth of a healthy society that seeks to create a nation like all other nations. The demythologization of the Jewish people is one of the great gifts of Israeli society to the Jewish people. The demythologization of the Jewish people, which has animated so much of this rabbinic story and political theory I've been trying to tell, that demythologization of that myth is one of the gifts of an Israeli society. Statehood has shattered the credibility of the grandiose sermons about the nature of the Jewish people that rabbis often give in the diaspora. Although it is true that history reveals our heroic determination not to be defeated by the enemies of Judaism, and although the mystery of our survival in history evokes admiration and wonder, the truth is that we are also Nebuch, a people. I don't quite know how to translate Nebuch, it's a technical term. If you go down to the next paragraph, by allowing our bodies, not just our heads, to be visible, our ideal of normalcy has restored dignity to Jews and the freedom to engage in every human activity. For Yitz, it's the Holocaust that ruptures this story of what we've had to inherit from Judaism. For David, it is the story of the demythologization of Judaism in the state of Israel and the challenge to not simply be a lofty story as we inherit from Rabbinic Judaism, but an opportunity to test out what it means to be an actual people. Right? What he's basically distinguishing between the Jewish people as an act of imagination, which is an act of imagination, which is the story of Rabbinic Judaism, versus the Jewish people as a concrete entity that has to act in history. But both Yitz and David are therefore stuck. It's something we have to be conscious of. They're both kind of stuck that the burden of evidence becomes not just what it means to embrace the state of Israel as a Jewish possibility, but what it means to also be a deep inheritor of this rabbinic tradition. In some ways, I sometimes wonder whether when we do good Jewish education, we're actually doing good anti-Israel education. Like a deep reading of these rabbinic stories suggests a kind of deep skepticism of an active involvement and a participation in history, right? Of a kind of fear of the consequences of actually getting your hands dirty. An embrace of martyrdom makes more holy the act of victimhood than it does the act of aggressor. So the more we do good Jewish education, and we imagine that the inevitable outcome of that Jewish education is someone's attachment and loyalty to the state of Israel, we are actually doing an act of indignity both to what that all of that Jewish textual history animates in us versus what the state of Israel actually challenges us to do. Last line I'll say, the Torah of Israel, to actually take that story of Rabbinic Judaism and animate it as part of the story of the state of Israel is a much trickier project than we give it credit for being. We imagine that because we feel that we may be on the right side of history because of the past 66 years, that therefore it's obvious that this juxtaposition between what it means to be a good Jew and what it means to be the state of Israel should go hand in hand with one another. But one of the core challenges that we face is that this narrative of Rabbinic Judaism casts us in some ways against some of the challenges that we confront rather than in relationship to them. Some questions? Russ.
Yehuda, what if Rabbinic Judaism is an explanation rather than a prescription? So what if it is a way of giving meaning to the lives of people who are living as victims, rather than an elevation of passiveness and victimhood above something?
So the question is, what if Rabbinic Judaism is a explanation rather than an elevation of ideology, right? This is the way to make do with historical circumstances that we don't have under our control. And I guess the extension of that argument is therefore, if I don't need that excuse anymore, I don't need that justification or rationalization. I suppose that that's one way to read what the rabbis are doing. right, which is Yochanan ben Zakkai describes this escape from Yavne this way, not because he thinks that's the lofty vision of what Judaism should become, but because he needs a better explanation, right? You're picking up on that response to Rabbi Akiva that says he didn't have a choice. You want him to have asked for sovereignty when he in fact asked for escape.
Well, I'm looking at
Yeah.
historical context. What are the rabbis trying to do? They're trying to hold together a people who've been devastated. They're trying to give them a narrative that would allow them to
Yeah.
move forward.
I guess the only response I can say to that is that what that does, that you're making a history of Rabbinic Judaism, and I think it's a credible reading, that what it does is it makes Rabbinic Judaism historically contingent. I mean, the exact problem is that therefore Rabbinic Judaism is only what it's doing is it's helping to hold the people together under these circumstances. And I wonder whether, if you make that argument, my attachment to Rabbinic Judaism then falls apart when I no longer need it. Meaning, in some ways, that's what a secular Zionist might say. Rabbinic Judaism animated the Jewish people for 2,000 years because they needed an instrument to hold themselves together because they didn't have any force in history. But now they have force in history. What do I need from Rabbinic Judaism anymore? Okay, well, we can hopefully come back to it. Yes, Jerry?
If you take a look at the boundaries, you have a boundary of moving from sovereignty to non-sovereignty, and then you have a boundary of moving from non-sovereignty to sovereignty. You created a story or a structure where Yochanan ben Zakkai created a new reality, but the myth connected it to the prior and made it a continuity. Now you're at the very end. You articulated the problem that we're at another cusp where we went from non-sovereignty to sovereignty, and you're worried that there's a disconnect. Well, Yochanan had the same disconnect. Maybe what we need is that same. Maybe what we need is we don't have enough time because we only have 66 years, but we need after 300 years we can have a mythology that takes sovereign Israel and the new Jew, the sovereign Jew, and connects it to the non-sovereign Jew in the same way. Maybe we just haven't had enough time.
I always think that's true. The last part, we never seem to have enough time. I guess where this takes us to a little bit of a different place, but the most formidable attempt to do that, which is to try to dovetail this story with some antecedents, has been essentially religious Zionism. Right? What religious Zionism tried to do was, instead of the move of secular Zionism, of the radical severing and because Boyarin acknowledges, right, if in order to make this work, I have to kind of leave behind these old categories and animate a different ideological narrative for the Jewish people. Religious Zionism tries to thread the needle that I'm actually living with the historical continuity of Rabbinic Judaism, but I'm making a shift. And the problem is, this could be a long critique of religious Zionism, but I'll just diagnostically name the problem. The problem is that the best technique to make that continuity work is Messianism. And Messianism has its own, let's say, baggage. It also, and part of the built-in problem, the flaw of Messianism, is that the longer you stretch out the delay of time, the less credible the argument of the immediacy or imminence of the resolution to that is actually on the horizon. This was one of the problems that early Christianity dealt with, and it's what modern religious Zionism deals with as well. Which is, if I'm going to try to argue that we are actually part of an unfolding historical reality which is contingent on what comes before, the best way to make that work is to imagine that I'm part of the final days of something that was predicted long before me, and I'm part of that narrative. What other techniques we might be able to use to thread between the inheritance of Rabbinic Judaism and the contemporary Israel, I think it's possible, but maybe we need more time. Yes?
I think Rabbinic Judaism is a thing of just incredible beauty. It's, in a sense, being freed from gravity. You are allowed to float and live free of stateness, which is an incredible thing. Aside from being a survival mechanism, which it clearly was, and who are we to argue with 2,000 years of relative success? But it's also a thing of great beauty. As I said, it's like being freed from gravity. You exist free from the state. Remember, as a society, we started with tribalism, And we grew up into city-states, and then we became states, and now we become nations. Who's to say that that's a permanent thing? We may well grow out of, I mean, you already see a little bit of that in Europe, a little bit. But we may grow out of that as well, and I think Rabbinic Judaism offers you a way to live that is freed from those boundaries of state, and it also allows you to live if your state goes away. And I think in that context, it's not only a means of survival, it's a bit of a formula for an incredible way to live.
Look, I'm a big fan of Rabbinic Judaism, both in text and in form. I think the same language, however, about its effectiveness of its detachment from gravity also produces the possibility of, in the context of modern political sovereign realities, its very banality. Right? What the rabbis do is they relocate in many ways the energy of what community looks like from being the sovereign space to the local and domestic space, household, courtyard, Beit Midrash, right? To some degree, community. It's one of the great innovations of Rabbinic Judaism is the charting out of our own space relative to real space by a mechanism called the Eruv. Right, on the theory that a little bit of chicken wire totally reframes how we think about space in the world. Right, that suddenly it's amazing. It's an amazing exercise in naming both insiders and outsiders. That outsiders become invisible to the context of an Eruv unless they interrupt it. And I can actually use that space to enclose an ideology in a community in an environment I don't control. But the challenge becomes, right, and this is exactly the flip side of that, it's a magnificent story, except to the extent that it pales in comparison to the existential questions that come when you actually do control sovereign space. When I actually don't need chicken wire to define the boundaries of what I'm actually responsible for. Where I can't make invisible the realities of the political world in which I live in search of that kind of lofty, detached from gravity vision of how to constitute community. It's the very magnificence that you're describing that I think we see in the rabbinic tradition is part of what makes it difficult to adapt it to the political realities that come when you're actually living in sovereignty. Yes?
This builds on all these previous questions. I think it makes sense to focus on what the rabbis did rather than what they said. Their political reality was different, and they made up a symbolic world, which made it possible to live vibrantly within that new world. I don't think the rabbis ever thought that would be the last work of genius the Jews were capable of. There has been an interpretive tradition between the rabbis and us that integrate different realities with our spiritual world. And I think we need to do another work of genius now to integrate the new political reality of Israel with our spiritual world.
I totally agree. I guess the challenge, what's tricky about that is the work of political genius, or the work of genius right now. These are our raw materials and our equipment, and sometimes.
We have all of us and all of our different.
Right, and I guess the way I know how to do that work is in reference to this, and sometimes. I guess part of the argument is sometimes this helps and sometimes it actually gets in the way. And that's part of what Yitz and David Hartman were both navigating, which is to what extent does this actually give us tools to do that work, and to what extent does it actually get in the way? What do we have to end out of that history in order to be able to amount a new credible history? Yes, in the back.
Aren't we creating a myth about the loftiness of the diaspora? I think of, let's say, the ultra-Orthodox, who, well, a lot of them are against Zionism, and yet in the United States there's so many scandals with cheating the government. It's not just that.
I'm sorry,
the
you know what you said?
There's a lot of scandals with the public school system. They take over boards. There have been a lot of scandals going on. And historically, the Jews were not removed from politics. They had other leaders basically making deals with the government. So this idea that we live in some kind of celestial world or something removed from reality, I don't think was ever true. And it seems to be we're trying to make an economy between now we have responsibility, then we didn't. And we did, and it didn't necessarily make us any better.
I think there's a dramatic difference between the political responsibility that's exercised by diaspora, which is sometimes about the mechanism, the instruments of survival in a context in which you don't control, and some ways the politics of minority behavior in a majority culture are so dramatically different than the politics that I'm talking about today, which are the politics of majority sovereign behavior with military power. There's no doubt, right? And this, we could read the Book of Esther as an exercise in that, of what happens when Jews have to actually make power happen in a context in which they have none. And every piece of that story, whether it's finding out about plots against the king and then keeping it for a rainy day, or pretending you're not Jewish in order to work within the system, or doing things that you consider to be morally problematic, like the beauty contest, in order to be able to get inside the halls of power. All of those are instruments not of power but of powerlessness. They're instruments of survival within a context where you don't actually have sovereign control. So I agree with you that that's been a big story. I'm not trying to undermine all of the various attempts at exercise of power that became synchronous and part of the narrative of Rabbinic Judaism. One of the classic Rabbinic ideas of Dina de Malchuta Dina, the law of the kingdom or the princehood, is actually your law, which requires you to rethink what it means to belong in a space that's not yours. All of those, I think, are there. I think they're substantively different than what the rabbis are working against here. Yeah, go ahead.
What I'm trying to say is I don't think there's this concept that, and what was just said before, that it's so wonderful we're not of this world. And I think we always were, and not necessarily for the good or for the bad. It's just that you talked about the law of the nation. You also did things to circumvent that. Like I just said, people not paying their taxes, doing certain things.
Yeah, I would say the reason I want to put that to this, the reason I want to set that to the side is because I actually think there's no way to redeem that. So yes, people behave badly, but I have no idea how to put that into a political. Let me take another one. Yeah.
I want to just try to rehabilitate the Zakai bet and say that this model that he gave us of how you deal with the loss of sovereignty can also be a model for how we deal with the regaining of sovereignty. And he didn't throw out the whole thing. They reinterpreted things. They got rid of what they didn't need. For example, if he had made the choice to keep the temple, we wouldn't be here today. Judaism would have been dead. The corruption, the irrelevance, the thugs, the temple, we would have been like everybody else, and we would have disappeared. We wouldn't be here today. And the rabbinic model to maintain us in a time of non-sovereignty enabled us to be here today to reclaim the land of Israel. When we reclaim it and reclaim sovereignty, we look back, try to come up with the same model of, okay, what do we say? We have to get rid of martyrdom. That's an example. We can't do that anymore. That's a prescription for death. But we say the things that should inform how we go forward.
To the extent that we, of offering a hakarat tov, a sense of gratitude to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, I'm with you. No doubt, right? The self-conscious awareness of the innovative move of Rabbinic Judaism that's in that story, of what has to happen now that couldn't happen before, of course. Whether it's true historically that he didn't have a choice and that was the only way to make Judaism come alive, who knows, right? Because there's no way to evaluate whether it's the right choice. It's just the choice of our own heritage. But what I'm trying to take into account is what becomes identifiable with that heritage in that choice. If we're not evaluating is it good or bad. That's what we have. That's our story. That's our myth of origins as the Jewish people. But what becomes then almost necessarily contingent with being the inheritors of that story is much more complicated. That it's a choice to do something that then the return to Zion is not in itself an inevitable choice. And I guess this is the key piece. I'm not convinced that Zionism has to have the force of historical continuity in order to be ethically meaningful. I think part of what religious Zionism, what you're saying, embodies in it is, I want to make this a more historically continuous narrative in order for it to hold together. That's in and of itself a move. It requires a leaping over, a translation that I'm not sure we necessarily have to do. Yes?
Would you want to read this at least in some measure, is saying the rabbis actually are making a political argument. That is to say, the realization that if they participate in the polity, they'll have to cede some of their own authority to other authorities. All of a sudden, the Rosh HaMemshalah has as much power as the rabbi.
Let's hope. Yes, I think that's a key feature of that political theory. But then what are the consequences of a political theory that's actually run by those who are constituting community and making its rules? Right? If the full logic of that argument says that political power should remain concentrated in rabbinic and religious leadership. And there are certainly Jews, the ultra-Orthodox Jews who disavow the meaning of the State of Israel and Zionism are a fraction, right, who really stand in opposition to the State of Israel, are a minor fraction of the ultra-Orthodox community. There is a larger voice within the ultra-Orthodox world that still believes that the religious power of rabbinic leadership is a choice and a more central power than political leadership, right? That too is part of this political theory. But the political consequences of that are quite significant for the present.
During this period that Rabbinic Judaism formulated its position, was there any opposition to it? Was there any discussion of different views?
Sure. The thing is, we're the inheritors of this. This is the classic version of the winners write history. There's the rabbis themselves. This is a key historical piece. This text is not inevitable, nor is it majority. Right? This is a group of people writing a particular version, a narrative of history, that over time is an effort to accumulate authority and not an intrinsic automatic transference of authority. In other words, from a historical perspective, when historians look at this, what actually happened in the wake of the temple destruction? You have a kind of centrifugal force. Judaism spins out in a lot of different directions. One of these choices is this one. It makes a credible claim, this was Michael's point, it makes a credible claim gradually and over time on the Jewish mythic and historical imagination and attracts adherents. And it's only really until centuries later that it becomes the dominant narrative story of Jewish history. Plenty of others are making different claims. That's part of the reason to try to understand that it actually has a political theory operating in it. Because it's trying to do something that's not merely describing political realities, but trying to accumulate power in politics as part of what it does. That's why it needs a political theory, right? If you're going to have an operating system to remake Judaism in the wake of its destruction, it better have a political theory because that's the way it's going to make sense to people. Yeah, Wes?
Yehuda, first of all, thank you. It's just incredible kind of conversations. You've put the rabbinic pacifistic tradition in dialogue with the Jewish-Israeli soldier with the gun 30 meters from here, which is really thoughtful and interesting. Can you put the rabbinic pacifistic tradition in dialogue with the Holocaust?
I'm hearing a lot of no's. I'm not sure why. I think it's a very reasonable question.
This received tradition for 2,000 years, and said, what do we do with this tradition in light of this huge reality of the modern state of Israel? That's a beautiful question. But I think in order to appreciate that question, you also have to ask the parallel question, this received tradition in dialogue with the Holocaust, which is one reality to which and from which the state of Israel responds and perhaps remedies. So if you take that right, so I think for this lecture to be complete, a word about, the logical implication of powerlessness is Auschwitz. So Kafka's about what the tradition says, if this tradition of pacifism, God is dead, you screw a harlot on the Sefer Torah in the middle of the Kodesh Kedoshim, and the Ribbono Shel Olam doesn't do anything. The extension of that in history is Auschwitz. So say a word about what the tradition says about that reality.
Well, in the context of these sources, I do think there's a meaningful distinction between Yitz's response and David Hartman's response, which are actually that hinge themselves on the two different political realities. For Greenberg, the animating event of the 20th century, which requires a rethinking of this Jewish theology of pacifism, is the Holocaust, and for David Hartman, the animating move of the 20th century is the State of Israel. It's very interesting because obviously the Holocaust and the State of Israel are in dialogue with one another, even though politically you can't really say that, right? You're not supposed to say that the Holocaust is the animating force of the state of Israel. But from a theological standpoint, they both seem to polarize around this issue, where Greenberg essentially says the Holocaust has to end this narrative of Rabbinic Judaism. That's the full logical argument of Greenberg's position, and he has many more places in which he does it. And one of his and Hartman leaves actually, and we talked about this last year. Only has one significant article of the treatment of the Holocaust, and that's Auschwitz or Sinai, which is not really about the Holocaust, but about trying to avoid allowing the Holocaust to be the dominant moral voice in creating and mounting the state of Israel. Now, what's interesting about that distinction between Holocaust and Israel is that both of them yield, through Holocaust and through Israel, they both yield a theology of pluralism. For Greenberg, the Holocaust ends the idea that there's one monolithic understanding of Judaism, because he's terrified that the consequence of monolithic thinking is fascism, right? Of trying to get everybody to obey to one view, and therefore truth is broken. So what Yitz is left with is trying to pick up the pieces of a shattered theology of Rabbinic Judaism with the fluidity to then take this and leave that behind, which requires the tolerance or belief that other people can pick other things and leave other pieces behind. For David, pluralism comes around because sovereignty puts on the table an exercise that the Jewish people just haven't had practice in doing. Was that he's a religious Zionist, David Hartman, who actually embraces the secular Zionist ideal of the demythologization of Judaism, which makes him excited about the Jewish possibility of these soldiers. That these are a vision of Judaism that we actually don't have a historical antecedent to make sense of, and therefore there's something wrong with the tradition itself that needs to be remedied and fixed. Beyond that, it's another shiur. I'm out of time. Thank you, everybody.